Okay, so here we go. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Marlis Hinkley, who's going to talk about the divine government and the English Civil War.
Yes, thank you so much, Alison, and thanks very much to the Beekeeping Association, both for your flexibility and for inviting me. I'm just delighted to be here today to talk to you all about glass hives and what I'll be calling moral science in the 17th century. So, can you all see my slides? Okay, we're gonna go for yes. So, again, I'm Marlis Hinkley, recently of Johns Hopkins University. I'm a historian of science and a specialist in the early modern period, so more or less 1500 to 1700. And I got really interested in beekeeping and bee science after doing some work with modern biologists on bee behavior. And there were kind of two things that struck me about the way that they were approaching this question. The first was a reliance on observation hives. So those quite thin glass-walled hives where you can see what's going on as the bees go about their daily life. And number two, a tendency in modern scientific publication to really try hard to avoid bees, to not talk about their desires, to not talk about their queens, all that sort of thing. And so I decided to look into the origins of these practices. I found that the first windowed hives date to the 17th century, and that this anti-anthropomorphizing approach is very much in contrast to the way humans have over the centuries related to bees. We can see that, of course, in the words that we use to talk about bees: queens, workers, drones, everyone going about their business. Since classical times, we have understood bees through comparisons to human society, and in fact held up bee society as a mirror to discuss our own. So with that, looking at the 17th century, I think there's a reason that so much interesting stuff is happening in beekeeping technology at this time. It's a time of revolutions. The 17th century is the century we most often associate with what's called the scientific revolution. Very rapidly, we talk about this in terms of the ethics synthesized by Francis Bacon, namely the idea that nature should be subject to systematic and direct observation and testing rather than understood through more general experience or logical deduction, which would have been the norm in the medieval period. Bacon natural phenomena, and this in turn would serve society by improving efficiency, production, medicine, and so on. The Royal Society, which still you can read the transactions of the Royal Society, was founded in 1660 for more or less this reason. It's also clearly a time in England of political revolution. There's the rebellion against King Charles I and his execution in 1649, the Commonwealth government from 1649 to 1659, more or less, the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, then later on in the century, the removal of James II and coronation of William and Mary, though I won't be talking so much about that period today. And so as a result of all this political turmoil, there's a lot of interesting political literature that's questioning what's the right system of government. Very closely tied into this is the fact that it's a time of religious change. There's intense religious conflict in England at this time between the sects known as Puritans and those who wanted an Episcopal church. There's still a Catholic presence around the edges. And so this question of what type of government is correct ties in really closely to questions about what God wants for people, and denominational differences in exegesis of both the Book of Nature and the Bible. Last but not least, it's a time of technological change in beekeeping. Some of the first documented box hives come from this period. And of course, the first documented glass or glass windowed hives come from this century. And so I think that this leads us to kind of a curious question that stood behind my research on this project, which is, if observation hives were invented in the 17th century, what happened to them? There's kind of an initial rash of interest. A lot of designs and new writing gets published about them in the mid 1600s. Then there's kind of this plateau, like not a lot of notable changes happen till into maybe the late 19th or early 20th centuries. And so the answer that I've come up with that I'll be presenting to you today is that glass hives in this time are meant to answer a particular need in the 17th century, namely the need to do moral science, studying nature in order to better comply with God's plan for humanity. And so people have different approaches to this moral science, which I've classified into four major categories, though they overlap somewhat. The oldest version, number one, is the idea that nature provides illustrations of known moral truths. This is a much more ancient tradition. It goes all the way back to early Christianity. Augustine, the early church father, pioneered the idea of the two books, the idea that God wrote two books for us, namely the Bible and the created world, and both are full of messages for humankind. The Bible is written in human language, so it's kind of our first stop. So we should look to the Bible for moral lessons, and then look to nature to find illustrations of these lessons. A second approach begins to kind of gain traction in the 17th century, which is basically the same idea but reversed. The idea that we can study nature to find out new moral truths. In a way, you could call this something of a Protestant approach to the book of nature, rather than relying on an exegetical apparatus. You can look with your own eyes and draw your own conclusions about what is written in the book of nature. The third type of moral science I'll discuss today is quite closely linked to this idea of the scientific revolution that I just mentioned. The idea that we can study nature to improve the human ability to manipulate it, and therefore kind of instrumentally fulfill divine commandments, such as looking after the poor. And I would say there's a fourth category that's also relatively new in the 17th century, the idea that studying nature is in itself a morally praiseworthy activity, like prayer. And so in order to pursue this moral science, people invented a new technology, the glass-walled or windowed hive. Here's 3 different designs that we'll be talking about over the course of the talk today. They're the ancestors of today's observation hives, but they looked very different, obviously. These, however, did allow people to observe bees directly and relatively systematically. You didn't have to wait to overturn the hive or take it apart to see them. To a certain extent, this allowed beekeepers to see bees just going about their daily activity in service of the various different types of moral science that I just discussed. And so I think the overall message of this is that in these hives, in the activity of these beekeepers, we can see a vision of natural science that's familiar to us in some ways, but very different in others. As in modern science, we see a focus on direct observation and the use of technology to help with that. But we also see an attitude that centers the divine in nature and therefore gives a very different account from what you would typically hear today of why we should do natural science. So just for a little background on traditional beekeeping, much of this is drawn from the work of Eva Crane, and who's written on this more and better than I could. If in medieval England, as in much of Europe, bees were mostly kept in skeps. So these were straw or wicker. Sometimes they could also be kept in hollow logs in an imitation of bees' natural habitat in trees. These skep hives have a lot of advantages for medieval beekeepers. They're relatively inexpensive, especially the straw ones are well insulated, which is a good thing in cold climates. However, they also have some very clear downsides. In terms of production, it's hard to get the honey out. The bees are all over the comb. For the most part, medieval agricultural writers suggest killing the bees to harvest the honey by drowning or smoking them out, although this will change its flavor. They pretty universally recognize that this is not a very efficient way of getting honey out. You don't really want to kill the golden goose as you are harvesting, but most don't see a good alternative. In terms of natural history, there's also disadvantages to a skep hive. If you're interested in seeing the bees, you have to tip the hive over, which obviously they don't much care for. And so you're unable to see the bees going about their activity relatively uninterrupted. At the same time, classical and medieval writers are still able to get a lot of pretty good observations about bee behavior, such as the existence of the queen, their tendency to pipe before swarming, and all sorts of things. These skeps will remain the dominant form of beehive through the 16th century, kind of into the modern period. Meanwhile, in the world of literature, medieval literature, bees had a prominent role as moral exempla, both as individuals and as a collective. Here I've got an image of a text that was very frequently copied in the Middle Ages, which is Pliny the Elder's Natural History. He wrote about bees, reporting, for example, that the king alone, they identified the queen bee as the king at that time, the king alone has no sting and is armed only with the grandeur of his office. And so medieval writers would pick up stories from Pliny, Aristotle, and other writers and turn them into moralizing tales about bees. So, for example, the idea that the king bee doesn't use his sting was taken as a moral lesson to kings, that they should rule by love and not by violence. As a result, it was picked up as a royal emblem more than once. Here's an illustration of King Louis XII of France, obviously wearing the beehive on his livery. There's also interesting stories that circulate about bees not only being particularly gentle, but particularly devout. One of my favorites was the story of a woman who her beehives were not doing very well. So she smuggled a communion wafer home from Mass under her tongue, put it in the hive to cure them. And in the morning, when she woke up, she said that the bees had built a tiny wax chapel around the wafer and they were saying Mass and playing and ringing the bells for Mass. And so in all of these examples, we can imagine that there might have been a base observation that got this thing started. Maybe they heard piping and thought that could be bells. But they take one general observation of a thing that bees do and expand it into this very far-reaching statement aimed at showing how God has placed examples of virtues like gentleness and piety in nature. This sort of two-strand approach that agriculture is happening or apiculture is happening on one side and natural history is happening on the other begins to change around the late 1500s, which is when we see these two strands of bee-related writing coming together and a lot of new texts being published. Here we've got a graphic of some of the early beekeeping texts in English. These very early ones, Hill, Googe, and Southern, those are pretty much just apicultural. They tell you about how to build skeps, how to put them in a bee house, techniques for extracting honey, etc. Here we have Butler's Feminine Monarchy, which I'll talk about in a minute. That's one of the first to really synthesize, bring together information about how to keep bees, and then a much longer literary tradition about bees, kind of who they are, what they like, what they symbolize. And then moving into the mid-century, all of these people figures will write about bees in a more synthetic way, as will pretty much the writers at the end of the century. And in some of these works, starting in the late 1500s, lessons taught by bees, rather than being taken to be general lectures in virtue, are connected increasingly directly to modern political questions. Baltasar Castiglione's Book of the Courtier, which was first published in English in 1588, uses observations of bees and their bee king to debate whether monarchy or republicanism was more accordant with nature. As Castiglione was writing in Italy at the time, which was divided up into republics and dukedoms and kingdoms, this would have been a very active political question for him to be addressing. One of the first books to touch on this in English, again, is Robert Butler's 1608 Feminine Monarchy, which would become one of the most widely cited books of the period. Although some of it is apicultural, much of it is drawn from older literary traditions about bees. We can see, for example, this is a frontispiece from the book. We've got what's basically a coat of arms here for the bees, and this motto, Solertia et labore, so ingenuity and work, more or less. So even though he's drawing on this older tradition, he brings in some modern touches. He says, for example, that experience and diligent observation, rather than reliance on older authorities, is the best way to gain knowledge about bees. And contemporary politics was likely involved. He's one of the first writers, and I think the first writer in English, to identify the queen as female. Probably no coincidence that he lived mostly under the reign of Elizabeth I. There is some debate about the direction of causality here, whether he argued that the bee was a queen to support the reign of Elizabeth, or whether the reign of Elizabeth simply kind of opened up the intellectual space for him to realize that she might be a she. But here we see a clear connection between a contemporary political advancement, the reign of Elizabeth I, and a change in how people are discussing their observations of bees. So to kind of sum up this first section, I would say that we can see in the first decades of the 17th century 4 key elements emerging in beekeeping, writing about beekeeping. The first is the unification of the natural historical literature with the apicultural literature. The second is an emphasis and insistence on the importance of firsthand observation. So not just more general exhortations to consider the bee, but this information has come from my experience. The third is the connection of observations about bees to specific questions in current politics. And the last is the development of new types of hives, specifically the box hive. So the first book I'd like to talk about here in depth is Samuel Hartlib's Reformed Commonwealth of Bees. It's a collection of correspondence published in 1651. So this is the early years of the Commonwealth of the Republican government, the interregnum, by Samuel Hartlib, an intelligencer who corresponded with people in continental Europe and England about various topics of interest. One of his central topics of interest was agricultural reform. And out of that came this interest in apiculture. He was also, as the title of the book might suggest, closely linked to figures in the parliamentary government. And his papers are now held by the University of Sheffield. They're fully digitized, and they contain references to various Republican figures, including Oliver Cromwell. Hartlib had a vision for the total reform of English society, and beekeeping was included in this project. And as a result, he published this work, which included several new beehive designs. And through them, we can see various ideas about how observing bees could contribute to moral science and the advancement of the English nation. The first of these was submitted by the Gloucestershire minister William Mew. This hive was essentially a hexagonal box with glass windows on each side. This is an illustration not actually of this hive, but of a hive based on that hive. And it was topped by a weather glass and sundial. And Mew, in the text that he wrote accompanying his description of this hive, wrote that there was a lot to be learned from the observation of bees, which is why he set up this glass hive in the first place. So he says, when I saw God make good his threat, solvam singula regum, and break the reins of government, I observed that this pretty bird whereof you write, so that's bees, was true to that government wherein God and nature had set it to serve. I considered that God gives us leave to make the most and best we can of these relics of his goodness. So here we see an explicit connection to the contemporary political situation. He's interested in bees because of the outbreak of war. And it seems from this quote very much like he's going to draw a monarchical conclusion. He's saying that bees are naturally obedient to their monarch. So, however, it doesn't seem from his other writings that he was a royalist. He claims elsewhere to have been sent up during the Long Parliament to serve the state. And in the end, in this writing at least, he doesn't really end up drawing any macro-political conclusions. Rather than saying that the bees teach us how to govern ourselves, he says the hive was to serve as, quote, a hieroglyphic of labor, close quote. And here, hieroglyphics were a thing that were very popular in the Renaissance, and it's more or less the idea that a visual emblem could capture an idea more fully than words. And so that by looking upon this emblem, by contemplating it, you would be able to come to a full and deep understanding of a particular concept. So in this case, he's suggesting that this glass hive, the purpose of it is to serve as a hieroglyphic. By looking at it and by taking advantage of the looking possibilities provided by the glass, people could truly understand what labor, a virtue, means. Curiously, he also suggests that this will be helpful for the bees. He suggested that by seeing out, the bees would be delighted by the view and, quote, redouble their labors, close quote, to produce more honey and wax. Lastly, he suggested that observing bees might be a way of understanding God's greatness in its totality. He described bees as magnalia Dei in minimis, so God's mighty works in the smallest things. Lastly, he provided a couple of supplementary arguments for the use of glass hives that were more loosely connected to, I would say, moral science. One is that they facilitate a type of contemplative activity that's suitable for times of political turmoil. Elsewhere, he says, as the marauding soldiers are going around, he retreats to his cot to watch the bees. And he makes an economic argument for his hive. So he's a clergyman. Many beekeepers at the time are. And he says that if beekeeping was broadly encouraged in society, the nation could make an additional £300,000 a year from it. Just for scale, an individual parish might be, or an individual head of a parish might be paid $300 per year. A freeholder household might have an income of $50. So £300,000 would have been just less than the total incomes of all the clergy in the country combined. So if this was to be the case, Mew suggests it could greatly profit the church and the nation. So in all this, I think we can see kind of three of the four ways I mentioned at the beginning of ways in which this beehive could contribute to moral science. The first is in that first way, the contemplative Christian tradition of the Middle Ages. They're providing an illustration of a known moral truth, namely the value of hard work. I think we don't really see the second type of moral science I mentioned, the idea that you can look at nature to learn new things about morality. We certainly see the third, that the study of bees can help pursue religious ends instrumentally, both because watching bees keeps people out of trouble and increased yields could benefit the clergy. And finally, we see the fourth type of moral science, namely that the study of bees is in itself a religious end. Through contemplating this hieroglyph, we could come to a deeper understanding of a moral principle. And I think that the most modern twist that Mew provides is, again, this emphasis on eyewitnessing. Well, his older contemporary or his older writings on bees might have been happy enough to simply say, consider the bee. He emphasizes that you have to look at the bee, ideally in a glass hive, to gain these religious benefits. The second glass hive in the work takes this more economic argument for the purpose of glass hives and really runs with it. So this hive was submitted by a German correspondent of Hartlib's, probably John Morion. It's a wooden hive meant to go up under the eaves of a building. We can see that it features what will be one of the main characteristics of new hive designs in this period, namely that it's modular. And these modular hives were advertised by their makers as preventing swarming. They'd noticed that bees split and half the hive flies away when there get to be a lot of them, and so they suspected that by giving bees more room, they might not divide. They also argue that they'll make harvest easier as the bees could be in one box while you got the honey out of the others. So these kind of solve very much in theory the main problem with skeps. Emphasis on in theory, as I'll discuss in a minute. The Morion hive was meant to be equipped with windows, Hartlib wrote, through which I could see in at my pleasure. However, he emphasized that pleasure was the least of it. It was mostly about economic gain. He suggested that a person might be able to get an entire ton of honey and wax from the hive. And that was partially because you could see into the hive through the windows and see when the bees might spare some honey, and then take it until they might not well spare any more. In the following letter, it's suggested that this economic gain could be used for the betterment of society at large. The American alchemist George Starkey notes that in general, from agriculture, extra money could be used to improve the lot of the poor. And specifically in the context of beekeeping, he suggests that the increased production of local honey-based alcohol would reduce drunkenness and the vice of drunkenness from foreign wine, improving public morality. Here's the quote. Whereas if it were once become, as it's easily so to be made a domestic commodity, the request it finds wine among these sipping gallants of our time would abate, and so this benefit at least would redound. So here I think we see a clear example of sort of moral science number 3, the idea that the study of bees can help pursue religious ends, both by increasing yields to benefit society and producing honey-based alcohol that will reduce vice. The final glass hive design in the work is by Christopher Wren, the architect of St. Paul's Cathedral. And I've included this here because his description shows that despite the sort of big claims made by the other glass hive makers, not everyone is convinced of their virtues. His design is for this hexagonal set of stacking boxes, each with a shuttered window. Hartlib really likes this design. He likes it so well, he proposes elsewhere in his papers presenting it to the Lord Protector, Oliver Cromwell. It is linked to the others. Wren says he based it on Wilkins' design from Wadham College, Oxford, which was based in turn on Mew's, the very first one I talked about. But Wren wrote that it was quite unsatisfactory. The bees didn't build in the top as he expected, where it would have been easier to harvest. They built wherever they liked. And so he said it doesn't really it doesn't really work. It doesn't have any advantage over traditional hives. And it is much more expensive to build. And so in Wren, I think we can see a more pragmatic take on this new hive technology. He is neither boasting of the broader moral benefits that Mew suggested or the economic benefits of the German hive, but he's speaking from experience, suggesting that it won't all be rosy. The last thing I'll say about the reformed Commonwealth of Bees is that I think it's curious that despite the name, there's very little content in it explicitly connecting the example of bees to the present political situation. None of type number 2, look at nature to answer present political or present questions about God's plan. And this is not the case everywhere. So Samuel Purchas's The Theater of Political Flying Insects, published in 1657, is very clear in its connection of bees to the Commonwealth government. So he says, for example, describing bees' social organization, that they have one common respect and reverence to their commander. He doesn't say king or queen, commander, by whose counsel their commonwealth is governed, a common house, a common care of posterity, common labor, common food, common generation, a common use and fruition of all things. Later on, talking about the queen, he will write that although they, the bees, are willingly subject to a leader, yet do they not altogether lose their liberty. If the commons see it not convenient to diminish their numbers, to swarm, upon the queen's grant, they kill the probationer and all of the blood royal, so that prerogative avails little in the commonwealth of bees. If this wasn't a clear enough connection to the recent execution of members of the blood royal in England, he then states that, quote, the polity of bees is admirable and imitable. So the one thing in this case is that it's not totally clear whether he's doing type 1 moral science or type 2, whether he's putting bees up as an example of a known truth, in this case that people do not concede their liberty, or claiming this is a new truth discovered through the observation of bees, but it is a very clear application of bee-based natural science to answer a question about how people should behave in accordance with the divine plan. All of this is happening during the Civil War, during the Commonwealth government, but it's only after the Restoration that glass hives enter what is arguably their real heyday. John Getty is the first Englishman to patent a glass hive. These images are from his patent application, which he does in 1675. He built this hive somewhat before that, as this image, very similar images can be found in Royal Society papers from earlier. And of course, we can see that these hives are very clearly based on designs from the 1650s. This design is very, very much like Wren's. The only real difference I can see is this addition of this internal structure. He does not, however, cite any predecessors. There's possible reasons for this. One is that he's applying for a patent, so he wants to emphasize his own priority. The other, which has been suggested by other scholars, is that this was a deliberate attempt to distance himself from Hartlib and other people that were part of parliamentarian circles. Getty's hive was in turn adopted by Moses Rusden, the king's beekeeper, who openly cited Getty and characterized himself as making improvements on Getty's hive. We can see that this illustration that he gives is pretty much an exact copy of Getty's, with the addition of this prominent king bee wearing a crown right here. This hive, we can be reasonably confident was actually built. It was probably seen by Samuel Pepys, who in one of his diaries describes going to the gardens of Charles II and seeing among other rarities a hive of bees, so as being hived in glass, you may see the bees making their honey and combs mighty pleasantly. Rusden has no hesitation, unlike his Commonwealth predecessors, in connecting his observation of bees to the present political situation. Despite the fact that it's been pretty clearly established by this point that the queen is a queen, he still discusses the natural king of bees. He says, for example, his government is just because he oppresseth none, the consequence of which is unity throughout the whole kingdom. A very clear call to unity in the aftermath of the Civil War. And for Rusden, the political virtue we can observe in bees comes from their nature, which is implanted in them by the divine. He says that they're guided by instinct towards prudence, foresight, economy, and fidelity. Consequently, studying bees may provide a way to learn more about these virtues. Interestingly, there's a way in which these moral virtues may themselves be considered a commodity. John Beale, writing in 1671 to the Royal Society, praised glass hives specifically and specified that they would produce 3 things to sacrifice upon our public altars, namely honey, wax, and the good example of piety, devotion, arts, and industry. This explicitly political reading of bees would continue throughout the Restoration period. Here is a section from John Evelyn's Elysium Britannicum, a pretty influential text that circulated in manuscript. He has very clear political bent. He calls bees, for example, a lecture of obedience to rebels. However, he proposes a new reason why this should be the case. Rather than suggesting that bees are a sign made by God for men, like Mew might have suggested, he says that they are so good an example because bees are acting in accordance with God's providential plan for them. He says, for example, that the bee is the wisest, the most artificial, namely able to do artifice, and approaching nearest the understanding of men. So I think we see here kind of a philosophical shift in the relationship between humans, bees, and the divine. God is not sending messages via animals to humans. Rather, he has a plan for humans and he has a plan for animals. And we might be able to learn something by looking at the plan for animals, but not necessarily. Because their social organization is comparable to ours, we may be able to draw political conclusions. But that's just because they think like us, not because they're encoding a message for us. And I think this comes across most clearly of all in the work of Robert Boyle. So this is Chemistry Boyle of Boyle's Law. He had a glass hive in the 1680s, and he very much enjoyed observing the bees. He affirmed that bees were insects with their own providence, and he said very able with strong natural instincts. He recommended watching them in a glass hive to take advantage of their natural sagacity. He said that he doubted that this came from rationality, but did not deny that it was useful to people. He suggested at one point that you could make a sort of weather glass using a glass beehive because they can tell when a storm is coming before people can. And in this way, you could use the glass hive as he called it, a philosophical apiary to allow humans to access bee knowledge. This is the knowledge that bees have of nature, including natural virtue. So, in other words, we can learn from the bees, but we cannot assume that they're written for us. The book of nature is not going to be a straightforward read. By the end of the century, it seems that interest in glass hives has kind of passed its heyday. It starts to diminish. There are multiple designs that are described or drawn in the philosophical transactions of the Royal Society in the 1670s and 80s, but you don't really see these anymore in the 1690s. There's also a slowdown in publishing on glass hives in general. I found not nearly as many pamphlets describing glass hives, for example, from this later period as from that 60s, 70s heyday. And some of this might be due to practical issues with them that became apparent as they were used over these decades. John Whirlige's The Complete Bee Master criticized them relatively harshly. He said, you couldn't really, the full quote is on the slide, but basically you can't really see much unless most of the bees are out because they block the sight of each other and the combs. And this, I think, seems pretty much borne out by our modern experience of observation hives. It could be a challenge to see what's going on in them, even at the best of times. And it depends on how the bees build their comb as well. He also, Whirlige, denies that they're more productive, as Mew or Rusden affirmed. And he did so on the basis of experience. He said that when he has built hives with windows, the bees tend to block each other's light, so it doesn't seem to make much of a difference whether the light is going in through the windows or not. He also said it was difficult to determine whether they found any delight in the sight of the light, as Mew would have suggested. The last thing I'll say about the possible sort of practical issues with these hives is, besides kind of imagining how the geometry would have worked, how they're just building their comb however they want inside of it, the glass available at the time was of varying quality. It would not they would not likely have had as much access to very clear, very large panels as we do today. And so you have to imagine how this would have looked through what we'd consider imperfect glass. So in conclusion, I think we can see glass hives as both reflecting and perpetuating different approaches to moral science in this period. So people want to look at bees because God left us coded messages about human morality there, or maybe because God made bees insightful and we might be able to learn from them, or maybe because contemplating the beauty of creation is in itself a good thing to do. Instrumentally, these glass hives and the study of bees could increase morality by finding God's moral precepts in nature, by helping us use our new knowledge to do other things that God wants us to do, or by engaging in the activities like contemplation of which a morally upstanding society is made. And so I'd suggest that the kind of plateau or decline in the popularity of glass hives may have had to do with the fact that in the 17th century they were answering a particular need that went away. And that's the search for answers in nature to present problems, both religious and political. In the 17th century, we see a need for moral science because of political and religious upheaval. In the 18th century, we see a shift away from this, what I'm calling moral science, towards what we recognize as natural theology, kind of a celebration of God through examining the complexity of nature, but without any specific connections between particular elements of the divine plan, like moral precepts, and specific behaviors or features of nature, like bee behavior. And as the acuteness of these issues fades, so does general interest in glass hives, which go on to become more the province of aficionados. So thank you all very much, and I'm really looking forward to discussing this with you.
Well, that's fascinating. Thank you very much, Marlis, for all of that. I'm hoping that some listeners are going to start posting questions in the chat box, as we don't have any at the moment. I think they're probably all just trying to digest the quantity and quality of the information that you've given us all. That's amazing. I've got a couple of questions myself, so I'm going to start with those as nobody else has popped up yet. And so there's a couple of things. I wondered if you know of any existing um, any existing examples of the hives that were described, whether any have actually survived.
That's a great question. I don't, and I looked. I really wish that they had, and it doesn't seem impossible that they would have, because as I think I've kind of alluded to here, these were luxury items, relatively
Yeah, yeah.
speaking. He belonged to kings, or Boyle, he's a member of the nobility. I would have kept one, but no, I have not found. The only thing that I have found are the illustrations and the descriptions.
Mm. But from the sounds of the criticisms of them and the sort of reasons for not using them, that it suggests that there were some actually in use practically, doesn't it? Do you think?
Absolutely.
Mm.
Yes. And I think that we see the evidence of them really existing in the literature. So, for example, we have the Mew hive, which he describes, and then we have the Wren hive, which he says he built on the basis of having seen this one at Wadham that was based on the Mew hive.
Yeah.
Then we have, so this is the one that I illustrated here is actually, this is the Evelyn hive, which
Okay.
was um, based on the Wren, well, yes, pretty much based on the Wren, based on the Wilkins, based on the Mew. And so by the fact that these designs are circulating, I think we see clear evidence that they were really made, as well as in the complaints about them. So uh, this last guy, Whirlage, he writes about them pretty extensively, says he's tried multiple different designs and has not really managed to make any of them work out. And maybe that's all his invention, but I think, given that that squares with how we, or at least how I imagine these probably would have panned out, I think that's his claim to have used them is very plausible, if
Yeah.
not 100% guaranteed.
Yeah. And you're right. I mean, there can't have been a huge number of them made, I wouldn't have thought, because, the you know, apart from the clergy, the royal families, the governmental, very wealthy landowners would have been able to afford them because glass itself was very expensive. And I did look up the window tax after our little introduction just earlier this evening because I wasn't quite sure whether the window tax was relating to the expense of glass or whether there was something else. But actually, it was a property tax. Um, but it was based on the fact that glass was really expensive, and so if you could afford lots of windows, then you were going to pay more tax on your building. So it was considered a luxury item. But I'm not surprised that those observation hives didn't really work because there aren't any frames inside them, are there? So it looks like
No.
square structures, and then the bees formed their natural comb within that. So they've sort of got something to hang it on, but there's no control mechanism for how it was built. And so it wouldn't be possible. It doesn't really help extract without removing the whole combs and destroying them in that sense.
Yes.
And so it would still be quite difficult, wouldn't it, um, to get the honey out. It doesn't really solve that problem. I'm going to just read out a couple of observations from some of the people that are now contributing. So Larry's saying, has anyone, as I'm asking if anybody's tried to build one from
Hmm.
from the directions, but I'm guessing you haven't come across that.
Again, not that I know of, but if any of you do hear of one, please, or if any of you do one, please do write to me. I That would be great to see.
I think there's a challenge there, isn't there, actually?
Definitely.
all of our all of our woodworking beekeepers to actually give it a go. Richard is pointing out that the Victorians used bees as a moral example for the labouring classes, giving clear instructions um, on virtue. So it is an attitude which carries on through from the 16th and 17th century. And Linda Schofield's saying that she heads up a team that runs an observation hive in their local museum in West Yorkshire. And the popularity of this feature has spanned several generations of local people and staff always asking, when are the bees coming back? So they've taken them to their apiary site to overwinter. But she had no
Hmm.
idea that um, the origins of the observation hives were so distant. So I'm going to suggest to Linda that their local museum in West Yorkshire might like to build some alternative observation hives. Um, so I might talk to Linda in a minute. But Tessa's also got a couple of questions about the alcohol being brewed, which presumably is mead. And
Hmm.
she's not sure if she misheard you, but I heard you say it as well, that the idea was that mead would benefit society by reducing vice, or was it the number of fights?
Vice. Yeah, no, I mean, I don't think you misheard. I think the argument is just a little bit funky in that the guy who makes it is arguing that people in England are drinking too much wine, too much imported French wine, partially because it's a luxury good, and therefore it's kind of this conspicuous consumption. So they drink a lot of wine to show that they're very rich, and then they
Mm.
get drunk, and then they do all sorts of vice things that are associated with drunkenness, like fight and commit sins and
In
etc.
inappropriate behaviors, isn't it?
Inappropriate behavior, indeed, exactly. And so he suggests that if they could be less reliant on foreign wines and make more alcohol domestically, including mead, it would lose its cachet to a certain extent. It wouldn't be so popular among these sipping classes. They wouldn't get so drunk, and then they wouldn't commit all these sins. So, I'm not sure that we necessarily buy this argument, but that's the argument in its fuller form.
Okay, interesting. Um, Going back to the observation hives and the bees, MacArthur's pointing out that bees don't like being exposed to the light, and so actually it would be quite difficult to spot the queen or king because they would be hiding in the dark
Yeah.
sections. Do you know if the glass hive was like the permanent home, or did they transfer them in and out of skeps? Because the way I've looked, the way I understand it, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, that the observate it was like a panel in the hive
Mhm.
in a wooden box, however ornate. Is that right?
Yes, yes, for the most part, like this. So you've got just a wooden box, and then it's got these little windows in it. Um, it's possible that this hive had bigger panels, but that's more or less the idea. None of them mention transferring the bees in or out, but I think, maybe it's certainly possible because these wouldn't have been very well insulated. This would have been a big problem with them, is that
Mm.
they're just a wood panel and that's it. Um, and they, I am confident that they built them. I am not at all confident that they got the results that they claim to have gotten from them. So Moses Rusden, for example, says it's true the hive with the windows does better because it warms up the bees. It's like a melon glass. It's like you put a melon glass over your melon to make it grow faster. You should put this bee glass over your bees to make them produce faster. But that all reads to me as very kind of theoretical. He thinks it should work this way. He doesn't think it necessarily
So
does work this way.
a melon glass, if it's shaped like a melon, would have a magnifying effect, presumably.
Yeah, and you see these, I guess they call them cloches as well, just a kind of a
Mm,
glass little
mm.
bell jar that you'll put over the plant and as it's just barely starting in the spring to give it a little bit of a greenhouse boost.
Yes, but that presumably would also increase the heat
Fry the beef. I
in
think these in
the
the summer they might
yeah,
have had a real problem.
it would be very difficult, wouldn't it?
Can I make an
Mm,
observation?
Oh,
please.
who's speaking?
It's Chris from Essex.
Hello,
Uh,
Chris.
Hello there. Um, just to fast forward, sorry I came on late to your talk, but fascinating. I'll have to do some research on your books on this. Um, I like to fast forward. Of course, Charles Darwin had an observation hive, and he studied that, and he went on, of course, the evolution of species. But in his later days, he came back to the understanding of creation. And that was Darwin. But not many people know that. He came back to the realization, yes, there is a creation. There is a creation.
Thank you, Chris. I think he was particular political pressure to do so, but we won't get into
No,
Darwinism.
well, I think he came to realize that it just didn't happen.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Can you mute yourself again now, please? And we've
Okay.
got a few more questions specifically about Marlis's talk. Um, Larry's wanting to know if you have found any evidence between, or was there any relationship between glass hives and the spread of Lutheranism at the time?
Oh, um, not that I have observed. And in fact, because of this expense issue, it's almost the reverse. So it's curious in that, as I've argued, this ethic you could say is a very Protestant ethic. The people that have the money to be making um, these kind of investments tend to be part of bigger institutions. So in the case of William Mew, he's a Protestant, but he's an Anglican. He's part of the Episcopal Church. Boyle, his religious leanings are what they are. Uh, Charles II, he's not, he's a Protestant, but he's not exactly a reformer. I think that in fact, if anything, we see an association between glass hives and a more conservative elements of religion, but just purely for money reasons, not because of an overlap in their epistemological approach.
Thank you. Yes. Linda is sharing a bit more information. And she's saying that the symbol of the cooperative society was a skep with bees, and there are many old stone frontages of co-op buildings with depictions of skeps and bees. So those images are long-standing in our traditions. Um, we've got a couple of volunteers for building some of these observation hives. JK and Larry have volunteered, so it might be helpful if you could send me some links to the illustrations so